In 1820, a man named Robert Gibbon Johnson stood on the steps of a courthouse in Salem, New Jersey, and ate a tomato in front of a crowd of hundreds of people who had gathered to watch him die. That was not a metaphor. The crowd genuinely believed he would collapse within minutes. Local physicians had warned that the tomato was poisonous. The press had called it the poison apple. One doctor predicted that the acidic juice would corrode Johnson's stomach lining and kill him before he reached the bottom of the steps. He ate the entire tomato. He did not die. The crowd reportedly stood in stunned silence. And the reason an educated man eating a common fruit in front of a courthouse was considered an act of suicidal bravado is one of the strangest chapters in the history of food. But the story of the tomato does not begin with Robert Johnson on courthouse steps in New Jersey. And it does not end with spaghetti sauce in an Italian kitchen. The real story begins in the mountains of South America, runs through the courts of European royalty, survives 2 centuries of mass hysteria, and ends with a question about what we lost when we turned one of the most complex foods on the planet into a red, tasteless sphere wrapped in plastic and shipped across continents in refrigerated trucks. This is the history of the tomato. And it is far stranger, far darker, and far more political than anything you would expect from something you slice onto a sandwich. Nobody planted the first tomato. It planted itself. The wild tomato emerged somewhere in the Andean highlands of western South America, in the region that now covers Peru, Ecuador, and northern Chile, growing in rocky soil along mountain slopes and riverbeds with no human help at all. And it looked nothing like the smooth, round, deep red fruit sitting in your kitchen right now. Wild tomatoes were tiny. Some were no larger than a pea. They grew in clusters like berries, came in shades of yellow, green, and pale orange, and had an intensely bitter, almost medicinal flavor that most animals instinctively avoided. The fruit was not appealing. It was not obviously edible. It was, by almost every measure, an unpromising candidate for one of the most important foods in human history. But somewhere between 500 and 700 AD, the indigenous peoples of Central America, specifically the civilizations of Mexico, the Aztec predecessors and their neighbors, began cultivating the wild tomato. Through generations of careful selection, they grew the plants that produced larger, sweeter, more fleshy fruit. They cross-pollinated the varieties that ripened most reliably. They bred the bitterness out and the flavor in. By the time the Aztec civilization was at its peak, the tomato was not a curiosity. It was a cornerstone of daily cooking. The Nahuatl word for it was tamal, meaning something close to swelling fruit or the plump thing. Aztec markets sold dozens of varieties. Red ones, yellow ones, small ones, large ones, each with its own flavor profile and culinary purpose. Tomatoes were cooked into sauces with chili peppers and ground squash seeds. They were blended with other vegetables and used to season meat, fish, and grain dishes. The tomato was not just food. It was a sophisticated culinary ingredient embedded in an equally sophisticated food culture that Europeans were about to encounter, misunderstand, and carry home in completely the wrong way. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in the early 1500s, they found the tomato everywhere. Hernán Cortés and his soldiers ate tomatoes in Aztec markets. Spanish chronicles from the period describe sauces made from tomatoes, peppers, and spices served at feasts in Tenochtitlan. The Spanish brought tomato plants back to Europe sometime around 1521, along with gold, silver, and a civilization's worth of stolen knowledge. And Europe promptly decided the tomato was probably going to kill them. The confusion was botanical. The tomato belongs to the Solanaceae family, the same plant family as deadly nightshade, one of the most toxic plants in the European natural world. When botanists in Spain and Italy examined the tomato plant, they recognized the family resemblance immediately. The leaves had the same smell. The plant had the same structure. And deadly nightshade could kill a person with a relatively small dose. There was also the matter of the pewter plate. Wealthy Europeans in the 1500s and 1600s ate from pewter dishes, which had a high lead content. Tomatoes are extraordinarily acidic. When a tomato was placed on a pewter plate, the acid leached lead from the surface of the dish directly into the food. Wealthy Europeans who ate tomatoes became sick, sometimes fatally, and blamed the fruit. What they were actually experiencing was lead poisoning from their own tableware. Poor people, who ate from wooden plates that did not react with tomatoes, ate them without consequence and survived perfectly well. But poor people's dietary habits were not considered relevant medical evidence in the 16th century. So the tomato arrived in Europe with a reputation it had done nothing to earn. It was called the poison apple in England. The French called it the pomme d'amour, the love apple, a name that may have reflected a belief that it was an aphrodisiac, which made it simultaneously exciting and morally suspect. The Italians called it pomodoro, the golden apple, because the first varieties to reach Italy were yellow, not red. For nearly 2 centuries across much of northern Europe, the tomato sat in aristocratic gardens as an ornamental plant. A curiosity. Something to look at, not to eat. It was grown for its appearance and feared for its flavor. And if you are wondering how a fruit that was eaten daily by millions of people across the Americas became a decorative garden ornament in Europe, the answer is that colonialism does not just extract resources. It also systematically erases the knowledge systems of the people it destroys, and replaces indigenous expertise with European suspicion. If you are finding this story as surprising as you expected, subscribe right now. We cover hidden histories like this every single week, and you will not want to miss what comes next because the tomato story is about to get significantly more complicated. The rehabilitation of the tomato did not happen in Spain, where it first arrived. It did not happen in England or Germany or France. It happened in Italy, and it happened slowly, and it happened at the bottom of the social ladder before it ever reached the top. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, poor farming communities in southern Italy, in Naples and the surrounding regions of Campania, were cooking with tomatoes. The reasons were almost entirely economic. Tomatoes were easy to grow in the hot, dry climate of southern Italy. They produced a large amount of food per plant with minimal investment. They could be preserved through the summer heat by cooking them down into thick sauces and storing them in clay pots. For people who were barely surviving on limited land and limited resources, a prolific, heat-resistant, calorie-providing fruit was not something you feared. It was something you figured out how to use. And what they figured out would eventually change the way the entire world eats. Neapolitan cooks began combining tomatoes with olive oil, garlic, and salt to create simple sauces. They spread those sauces onto flatbreads that already existed in the region. They combined them with pasta, which had been eaten in Italy for centuries but primarily with butter, cheese, or broth. The tomato did not invent Italian cuisine. But it transformed it so completely that it is now almost impossible to imagine Italian food without it. By the mid-1700s, the pizza margherita as a concept was taking shape in Naples. By the early 1800s, pasta with tomato sauce was a staple of the Neapolitan poor. And as Italian immigrants began spreading across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic to North America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they carried their tomato-based cooking traditions with them. The tomato arrived in America not as an American food, but as an Italian one, despite the fact that it had originated in the Americas in the first place. The tomato had traveled from Peru to Mexico to Spain to Italy and back across the Atlantic, accumulating an entirely new identity along the way. That is one of the most remarkable journeys any food has ever made. Back in North America, the tomato's reputation recovery was slow and contested. Robert Gibbon Johnson's courthouse performance in 1820 was partly theater and partly advocacy. Johnson was a horticulturalist who had been growing tomatoes for years and was genuinely frustrated by the persistent belief that they were poisonous. His public eating was a calculated act of demonstration designed to shift public opinion. It worked. Slowly. The tomato began appearing in American cookbooks with greater frequency through the 1830s and 1840s. By the Civil War era, tomatoes were being grown across the country and consumed in significant quantities. By the end of the 19th century, they were among the most popular vegetables in the American diet, even though botanically speaking they are a fruit. And that botanical question, fruit or vegetable, was not merely academic. In 1893, it reached the United States Supreme Court. The case was Nix versus Hedden, and it arose from a genuine trade dispute. Under the Tariff Act of 1883, imported vegetables were taxed, but imported fruit was not. John Nix, a produce importer, argued that tomatoes were botanically fruit and therefore should not be subject to the vegetable tariff. The Supreme Court acknowledged that yes, botanically, a tomato is a fruit. Then it ruled that for the purposes of commerce and trade, the tomato would be legally classified as a vegetable because that is how ordinary people used it in their daily meals. The tomato had now been the subject of a Supreme Court ruling. This was no longer simply a food. It was a legal, cultural, and economic battleground. Through the first half of the 20th century, the tomato was still a seasonal food. You ate tomatoes in summer, when they were ripe, locally grown, and bursting with the complex flavor compounds that make a truly good tomato one of the most extraordinary things you can put in your mouth. Home gardeners grew them. Farmers' markets sold dozens of varieties. Heirloom tomatoes in reds, purples, yellows, and greens sat in wooden crates at roadside stands across rural America. Then the industrial food system arrived, and it did to the tomato what the banana industry did to the Gros Michel. After World War II, large agricultural corporations began optimizing tomatoes not for flavor but for industrial performance. They needed a tomato that could be harvested by machine. That meant a tomato with thick, tough skin that would not split or bruise during mechanical picking. They needed a tomato that could survive weeks of refrigerated shipping from farms in California and Florida to supermarkets across the country. That meant a tomato that was picked green and ripened artificially using ethylene gas in sealed warehouse chambers. They needed a tomato that was perfectly uniform in size and shape so it could be sorted, stacked, and packaged efficiently by automated systems. Flavor was not on the list of requirements. The tomato varieties that dominated supermarkets from the 1970s onward were bred specifically to be tough, uniform, and long-lasting. And in achieving those goals, they sacrificed almost everything that made the tomato worth eating in the first place. A truly ripe tomato contains hundreds of volatile chemical compounds that combine to create its complex flavor. Those compounds develop during the final stages of ripening on the vine. When you pick a tomato green and ripen it with ethylene gas in a warehouse, those compounds never fully develop. The result is a tomato that looks correct but tastes of almost nothing. It has the color and the shape without the substance. Scientists studying the modern industrial tomato have documented the specific genes that were damaged or eliminated during decades of commercial breeding. A 2012 study published in the journal Science identified a genetic mutation that caused commercial tomatoes to ripen uniformly from green to red but simultaneously blocked the production of sugars and flavor compounds. The very thing that made the tomato look beautiful on supermarket shelves had made it taste like cardboard. The tomato industry had built a better-looking tomato and destroyed a better-tasting one in the process. The parallel to the banana is not coincidental. It is the same logic, the same economic pressure, and the same willingness to sacrifice quality for scalability. What happened to the flavor of the tomato is troubling. What happened to the people who grew them is significantly worse. In the early 2000s, journalists and human rights investigators began documenting conditions on tomato farms in Immokalee, Florida, one of the primary sources of tomatoes for the American fast food and grocery industry. What they found was a labor system that the Department of Justice would eventually describe using a specific legal term: slavery. Workers, predominantly immigrants from Mexico and Guatemala, were housed in crowded trailers by labor contractors who charged them for rent, food, and transportation at inflated prices. Some workers were held by debt bondage, forced to work off debts they could never fully repay. Others were physically confined and prevented from leaving farms. Between 1997 and 2010, federal prosecutors successfully prosecuted 7 separate cases of outright slavery in Florida's tomato fields, cases involving hundreds of workers who were held against their will and forced to pick tomatoes for the supply chains of companies that supplied McDonald's, Burger King, Yum Brands, Walmart, and Whole Foods. The tomato in your fast food burger cost roughly 1 penny per pound for the farm labor that picked it. The corporations buying those tomatoes were generating billions of dollars in annual revenue. The gap between those two numbers tells you everything about who the industrial food system was designed to benefit. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, a farm worker organization, eventually won a landmark agreement called the Fair Food Program, in which major food corporations agreed to pay a small premium per pound of tomatoes directly into a fund for worker wages and conditions. It was a genuine victory achieved against enormous institutional resistance. But it required years of boycotts, marches, and federal investigations to accomplish what should have been basic labor standards from the beginning. The cheap tomato, like the cheap banana, carried a price that never appeared on the grocery receipt. The pushback against the industrial tomato began in earnest in the 1990s, driven partly by the slow food movement and partly by simple consumer frustration with buying tomatoes that tasted like nothing. Heirloom varieties that had nearly disappeared from commercial agriculture began reappearing at farmers' markets and specialty grocers. Varieties like the Brandywine, the Cherokee Purple, the Green Zebra, and the Black Crim found new audiences willing to pay premium prices for tomatoes that actually tasted like tomatoes. Small farms specializing in flavorful varieties began operating in direct competition with the industrial supply chain. Scientists simultaneously began working backward, trying to identify which genetic traits had been lost during decades of industrial breeding and whether they could be reintroduced. Researchers at the University of Florida published work in 2017 identifying 13 specific chemical compounds responsible for tomato flavor and tracing which genes controlled their production. Several of those genes had been inadvertently suppressed during the breeding programs of the 1960s and 1970s. The researchers developed breeding lines that reintroduced those compounds into modern commercial varieties without sacrificing the disease resistance and shelf life that industrial farming required. The project took years and involved crossing modern commercial tomatoes with wild relatives from the Andean mountains where the tomato had originated 10,000 years ago. The solution to what industrial agriculture had broken was buried in the genetic heritage of the same wild, unpromising, pea-sized fruit that indigenous farmers in Peru had started cultivating more than 1,000 years ago. The answer was always there. In the beginning. The tomato has been through all of this before in different forms. It was dismissed as poisonous by people who did not understand it. It was adopted by the poor before the wealthy would touch it. It crossed oceans and accumulated false identities along the way. It was industrialized into near tastelessness by systems that valued appearance over substance. And it has been quietly reclaimed by people who remembered what it was supposed to be. It is the most widely consumed fruit on Earth in terms of total production, with more than 180 million tons grown globally every year. It is the foundation of cuisines on every inhabited continent. It sits in the center of Italian pasta, Mexican salsa, Indian curry, Turkish breakfast, Spanish gazpacho, and American ketchup, leaving traces of itself in almost every food culture that has touched the modern world. And yet the tomato you are most likely to eat today, the pale, firm, uniform sphere sitting in a plastic clamshell under fluorescent supermarket lights, is a shadow of what the tomato is actually capable of being. The flavor exists. The genetics are still there. The wild relatives still grow in the Andean highlands where this all began. The knowledge of what a real tomato tastes like has not been lost. It has just been made inconvenient. Somewhere in a greenhouse in Florida, a plant scientist is examining a tomato seedling developed from an Andean wild variety, measuring its flavor compounds under laboratory conditions, hoping it will survive the demands of a supply chain that was never designed with flavor in mind. Somewhere in Immokalee, a farm worker is moving through a field at dawn, picking fruit that will be on a supermarket shelf in 3 days and on your plate in 4, paid a fraction of what that fruit will eventually sell for. And somewhere in your kitchen, a tomato is sitting on the counter, ordinary and unremarkable, carrying 10,000 years of history, 3 continents of cultural transformation, a supreme court ruling, 2 centuries of completely unfounded fear, and a flavor it was never quite allowed to fully express. The tomato is the most transformed food in human history. What it becomes next depends on whether we value what it can actually be, or simply what it looks like on a shelf. If this story changed the way you think about something you eat every single week, hit subscribe right now. Every week we take the ordinary things surrounding you and reveal the extraordinary histories buried inside them. Drop a comment below telling us whether you will ever look at a tomato the same way again. We read every single one.